in the turn of the century, there were editorials in the New York Times, for instance, worrying that these women who were being employed in the department stores were going to fall into a life of crime because they were going to be surrounded by so much beautiful things. They were going to really desire, they're going to want to buy all of this stuff that they're surrounded with in the stores. So they were going to prostitute themselves, or they were going to steal things. And there was like a huge backlash and worry that this was very dangerous for young women. You know, this was part of this 1920s kind of progressive ethos that, on the one hand, women like, you know, the flappers, and they were really independent and starting to get into the workforce, and they won the right to vote in 1920. You know, all of that was happening. But at the same time, there was this huge backlash and worry about what that meant for women in the home and everything that we still kind of contend with even today.
Hey everyone, I'm Jean Chatzky. Thanks so much for joining me today on HerMoney, where we talk about how personal finance and money touches everything in our lives. I want you all to close your eyes for a second. Step back with me to the 1940s, specifically to New York City in the 1940s. You're walking down a crowded street, a stroller in one hand, a new purse in the other. You're wearing a modest knee-length dress, of course, and heading toward Lord & Taylor, your favorite department store. You drop off your baby at the nursery, have lunch with your 3 closest friends, pick up a steak for dinner that you will be making for your family later, and get your hair done. And imagine being surrounded by hundreds of other women on every floor of that store, serving you from the makeup counter to the kitchen aisle with a small handful of men sprinkled throughout. This is heaven. Department stores were not only the places where women shopped, but also the places where women had power. Power that they didn't have in other places at that time. My guest today, Julie Satow, took a deep dive into this world and a few of these remarkably powerful women. She is an award-winning journalist and author of the New York Times bestseller, When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. In the book, she follows 3 women from the 1930s to the 1960s who rose to the top of their respective department stores and carved new paths for what it meant to be a woman at work. Julie, hey, welcome to the show.
Hi, what an amazing introduction. I love that. I wish I could have started the book that way. It's great.
You know, we were talking before we started recording how much we loved this book. I mean, my introduction to these department stores really came in the 1980s when they were still glamorous. And my most glamorous friend at the time was a buyer at Bendel's. And I just was, when we would go out to dinner with her and her husband, I would always be in a panic about what to wear because she always nailed it. I was so excited to read this history. What made you decide to write about this and to focus on the 3 women that you chose?
Yeah, so I began thinking about department stores just as like sort of a moment in time that brought back a lot of nostalgia and interest. And I also had the same feeling. I sort of caught the tail end of the glamour days of the department stores. But I really wanted to focus on people this time. My first book was about the Plaza Hotel. So I felt like I wanted to push myself and focus on characters rather than a building necessarily. So I just kind of went into this deep dive of this world of department stores, trying to see if maybe there was a way into it for a book. And I stumbled onto 2 of the women first. I stumbled onto Dorothy Shaver of Lord & Taylor and Geraldine Stutz of Bendel's. And then I found Hortense Adlam of Bonwit Teller, and I felt like the three of them were each so different, but their lives kind of told the story of the 20th century, of women and work, and of this world of the department store.
Tell me about Ladies Mile. It ran from Astor Place, which for those people who are not familiar with New York is it's downtown. It sort of starts right around where the NYU campus exists. And it ran all the way up to Madison Square Park, which is for hamburger buffs where the first Shake Shack existed. And Ladies Mile was a place where women window shopped. How are the original stores different from the ones that we know today?
Oh, they were so different. I mean, these were universes unto themselves. Really, department stores began in Paris. Le Bon Marché was sort of considered the first one. But they pretty quickly came to America, to New York. The first one was a little below Astor Place at first. It was on Chambers Street. But then it eventually kind of morphed, as you mentioned, all the way from Lower Manhattan up to basically the Flatiron Building, which maybe a lot of people know, in addition to the first Shake Shack. And these were just enormous buildings where, as you mentioned in the introduction, you could really do anything there. You could spend an entire day. You could have a wonderful meal. You could have your hair done. They had nurseries to drop your children off to entertain them while you shopped. They had miniature zoos, some of them, incredible entertainments. A lot of them had even art displays. You could see Picassos and paintings and huge music departments where they had hundreds of grand pianos. They were just these worlds of glamour and grandeur. But also, they had bargain basements. So there were many different price points. You could have women who were very, very wealthy shopping next to working class women coming off the factory floor. So it was really this kind of a amalgam of all of that.
And they were a refuge for women who wanted or needed to work as well. I was thinking about The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and how when Midge needed to get a job, and I guess this was the 60s, maybe it was the 50s, she went and she worked at a department store. She worked on the well, I guess eventually the makeup counter, but also answering the phones.
Yeah, so she got demoted later and had to work as an operator. Yes, and that was what was so exciting when I started to do like the research, is that I realized, obviously this podcast focuses on women and money, and from a consumer perspective, women had this power of the wallet during, we talked about Ladies Mile. That was very revolutionary. At the time, women, really weren't even supposed to be walking on the sidewalks without a male chaperone. And suddenly, these stores provided an opportunity for women to congregate in public, to go shopping, to do this new pastime of window shopping, as you mentioned. And they had the money. There might have been male managers or male clerks, and they were the ones being served. So that was a different dynamic. And then from the employee perspective, absolutely, these stores were a really wonderful place where women, as far back as like 1905, 1906, could have these really fulsome careers at a time when obviously that was incredibly rare. You could have an entry-level job. You could work on the sales floor as a saleswoman, but you could also be, as you mentioned, buyers. I mean, buyers were incredibly powerful positions. They earned very high salaries for the times. A story in the book about 1906, this woman who began as like a dust girl, just dusting the china department in a store in San Francisco. And by her 20s, she was supporting her whole family. She'd moved them out of the Mission District into a very fancy house, across the bay. And she was only in her 20s, and she was going to Paris as a buyer. It was an amazing kind of opportunity for women.
And the numbers were huge. You write in the book that by 1920 there were 500,000 women working in sales. I mean, that's a That is a huge number. What's interesting is that despite the women who rose through the ranks, most of these women were working class, and the women that they served were often middle class and upper class. Was this a difficult balance to deal with?
It was. And I mentioned, that you could have careers in these stores. Not only did they have all these things for the shoppers, but they also provided a lot of support for the employees. So, I mean, some of it was paternalistic and maybe from our modern perspective feels a little sexist, and classist, but they did provide training. So as you mentioned, a lot of them came from working class backgrounds and their customers were middle and upper class. So the store owners really did put an emphasis on training them, giving them classes. A lot of the women could take classes in accounting to learn how to do the financial aspect of their jobs, but also proper etiquette so they could speak in a nicer way. They did hire mostly native English speakers, because that was a big thing. So there were issues like that. But they really did try to, a lot of these stores tried to provide the support to raise the women up and help them serve their clients better. So,
did this experience for the women who were working trickle into the management of family finances? We know that many women, even today, or until very, very recently, have been the managers of the budget at home, responsible for 85 to 90% of the purchases overall in the United States, not just for their families, for themselves, but for the men in their lives. How did this experience in the workforce shape home life?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't get into it too much in the book because it's a little bit before the era I cover, but essentially the Industrial Revolution had a massive impact on women and finances, because before everything was made in the home. And as purchasing started to become a bigger issue, and obviously department stores absolutely played a role in this, women now were in charge of the family finances, and they were the ones going out and buying the groceries or buying the clothing. So that did give them a lot more power in the family dynamic as well as out in the world. And so that absolutely, the department store was a part of that, was piece of that evolution. And I mentioned the power of the wallet. But in terms of like the home life, I mean, obviously women working was, especially in the early part of the 20th century, was a really had huge societal impacts. And the stores played, because they were such a large employer of women, absolutely were part of this conversation. So it's really interesting. There was a lot of hand-wringing and sort of concern and fear about what it meant for young women to be out working in these stores. So in the turn of the century, when this started to really happen, there were editorials in the New York Times, for instance, worrying that these young girls who were being employed in the department stores were going to fall into a life of crime because they were going to be surrounded by so much beautiful things. They were going to really they're going to want to buy all of this stuff that they're surrounded with in the stores. So they were going to prostitute themselves, or they were going to steal things. And there was like a huge backlash and worry that that this was very dangerous for young women and they were going to be influenced by this. And this was part of this 1920s kind of progressive ethos that, on the one hand, women like during the flappers, and they were really independent and financially independent and starting to get into the workforce, and they won the right to vote in 1920. All of that was happening, but at the same time there was this huge backlash and worry about what that meant for women in the home and everything that we still kind of contend with even today.
At the top of the show, we talked about how you really focused this book on 3 women. I want to dig into each of them, but before we do that, we're going to take a quick break. We are back with Julie Satow, author of When Women Ran Fifth Avenue. You focused this book on 3 women and 3 fascinating women, and I want to talk a little bit about each one of them. But before we even get into that, I hope you sold the movie rights. Have you sold the movie rights?
If anyone is listening and they're a producer and they're interested, the option is still available. So
I was thinking about Lynn Povich's book, Good Girls Revolt, and how that was made into a series that I watched the whole thing, loved it. Somebody who's listening should make a movie out of this. I'm just saying. But let's talk about Hortense. Hortense was a suburban housewife. She was a mother up until the day that she needed a dress for dinner. I can totally relate. Tell me about what happened and how that influenced her approach when she went to work at Bonwitz.
yes, so Hortense she grew up in a very small pioneer town in Utah. Her grandparents were early converts to the Mormon religion, and they came from Europe and were some of the first white settlers to St. George, which is a beautiful part of Utah. And she grew up sort of making her own clothes and growing her own food, very far from the world of Fifth Avenue department stores. And through various things that occurred, she ended up in New York City with her husband, and they were just starting out in the world, and she was a young mother. And her husband was invited to a fancy colleague's house for Thanksgiving, and they didn't have any family in New York, so they were going to this house, and she was very intimidated and nervous and did not have anything to wear. And in what sounds crazy in today's world, she left her baby napping in Brooklyn and took the subway to New York City to a department store to try to buy a dress for cheap so she could wear it to this Thanksgiving dinner. And she didn't have much money. She had $10 to spend on a dress, and the saleswoman was a little snobby and told her, just go over there with the cheap dresses and pick out what you could. And there was really nothing to wear. They were all pretty horrible, and she was stressed out about getting back to her baby, so she grabbed what she could and ran home. And the dress looked horrible, and it had a huge impact on her because it was embarrassing and stressful and not an enjoyable moment. So later on, many years later, when she had more power and a career at Bonwit Teller, that was very influential in the way she thought about shopping and women.
And she transformed Bonwitz into a profit center in the 1930s when a lot of other stores were struggling at that time, understandably, given what was going on in the world. How'd she do that?
Yeah, she really was, like all the women, just brilliant. She had never had a paying job before. She had never worked outside the home. And she started to help her husband out, who owned Bonwit Teller in the 30s. This was the height of the Great Depression. And he was planning to close the business. It was doing terribly. It was on the cusp of bankruptcy. And he felt very guilty closing it because it would have put hundreds of people out of work at a time when there were no jobs. So he asked Hortense if maybe she should go over there and see if there's anything they could do about shopping, about the store to turn it around. And given her experience as a young mom and a shopper herself, she saw a number of things that she felt they could fix. And so she started to help out. And before long, she actually, became president of the store in 1934, which is the first woman to ever become president of a major Fifth Avenue department store. And she did things that we take for granted today, such as hats. Hats are kind of an impulse buy. You might, you walk into a department store now and they're one of the first things you see. You see purses, maybe some jewelry, and you see hats. Hats used to be, way up on the top floor somewhere that was hard to find. And Hortense thought, well, hats, especially in the 1930s, where you might think of those old movies where everybody wore a hat. That was much more part of it. It was the same as wearing a shirt. You had to wear a hat. She realized how silly that was not to have it easily accessible to women to buy, if they happened to be walking through the store. So she moved the hat department by the entrance, and that really helped their bottom line. So that was just one example of so many.
Eventually, Hortense would go on to disavow her working life, and she regretted it. What happened?
Yeah, she was the hardest character for me to write, especially as a modern woman, working mom. It was hard. She So part of her motivation to work at the store was to be closer to her husband. The relationship was going through various stresses, which you can read the book to find out about. And I think she hoped that it would bring her closer to her husband, but it didn't end up working. And I think in retrospect, she felt, very sad about a lot of personal tragedies and things that occurred in her personal life. And I don't know. I mean, she really did blame her job and her career for a lot of what occurred later on. Whether that's fair or not, I think it's important to put her into context, into historic context. And it was very, very challenging in a way that I think it's hard for us to understand today what it was like to be a woman running a business. This was like a $200 million business in today's dollars she ended up having 1,500 employees or something like that. It was a huge undertaking and she came under a lot of stress. And yeah, she did in the end say that it was the worst thing that ever happened, and she did not believe that women should work outside the home. So
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that a lot of women, particularly a lot of women in our audience, would go that far, but I do think relating to the inability to balance work life and family life is something that we all deal with.
we all do. And there was so much, the lack of support back then. Think how hard it is today in today's world still to balance that stuff and do everything, right? And we can't do everything. Back then, there were far less support and far less understanding. So I think it was just that much harder. So it was really enlightening to see. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, the other characters, and they made very different decisions in their personal life to pursue careers.
They did. I mean, Dorothy Shaver arrived in New York end of World War I at a time when, as you write in the book, quote, a wave of single young women were converging on big cities across the country in hopes of carving out careers. I mean, we had this new female archetype, the flapper, emerging at that point, and a generation of women who wanted to be financially independent. Tell me about her.
Yeah, so we talked a bit about that earlier, that there was in the 1920s, there was really this universities started opening their quotas to allow more women to have educations. Women had gain the right to vote. There was the flapper, and there was this whole move for more women to kind of claim independence, financial independence. And there was this societal backlash and concern about what that would mean for all sorts of things. But Dorothy was part of that. She came from Mena, Arkansas, a very tiny town in Arkansas, with her sister in 1919. They essentially had a suitcase between them. And she was very ambitious. She wanted a career. Her and her sister started a doll business, and it became a big deal. Her sister was an artist, Elsie. She was a very talented artist, and she created these dolls. And Dorothy had really a wonderful business sense, and she ran the business. And it became incredibly successful. And then through various things, Elsie wanted to creatively move on and stop making these dolls. And so Dorothy got a job at Lord & Taylor in 1924. And by 1945, she was president of the company. And Life magazine dubbed her America's #1 career woman. And she earned the highest published salary that we know of at that time, about over $1.5 million in today's money. So she earned quite a lot of money. And personally, she made very different decisions than Hortense. She never married. She lived with her sister her whole life. And I think she really eschewed a lot of the feminine parts of her in order to make it in the business world. So that was very fascinating, especially compared with Hortense, so.
And she used her power to influence public affairs.
She was she was just a powerhouse. She created these Lord & Taylor award ceremonies where she would invite major thinkers. I mean, Einstein, Twyla Tharp, the dancer, the first person who created the rifle. She invited all these amazing people to come and speak, and really made Lord & Taylor be part of the political conversation and societal conversation. She spoke out against McCarthyism during the 1950s when there was a lot of the Red Scare. She was involved in the NAACP. I should say that her grandfather was a very famous in Arkansas, a very famous member of the KKK. So she came from a very interesting family background. And I think she really felt like a desire to work against some of that racism and stuff. So she was really amazing in terms of all of that. Yeah.
The final woman that you profile is Geraldine Stutz. As you said, she started her career at Glamour magazine and after 7 years went and struck out a new path at Henry Bendel. She was my friend Karen Greenspan's boss at Bendel's in the 80s when she was still there. And yeah, I remember hearing stories about her. I mean, she was formidable and really was able to negotiate to be paid more than other women of her generation.
Yeah, she was an incredible woman also. She did so many pioneering things that she's known for. She was in 1959. She was just 33. She was very beautiful. She had been a model and a college model, and she was made president of Bendel's, which was kind of this like very traditional, very expensive, but sort of where all the old dowagers would shop. It was not considered stylish or modern. It was very kind of fuddy-duddy. And she was young and very fashionable and very dynamic. And she came in and she completely remade the store. She really remade what a modern department store even meant. One of the first things she did was she created what was known as the Street of Shops, where we all take it for granted now, but if you see like little boutiques within the store, that was her idea. She made the main floor of Bendel's have all these tiny little beautiful boutiques that each sold their own things. So whether it was hosiery or makeup or purses, they looked very different and they were very beautiful and glamorous. And it was where everyone came to shop. Everyone from Babe Paley, and the Capote's Swans to like Mick Jagger and Yoko Ono. So it was definitely kind of the chicest place to be.
She didn't have a happy ending. I mean, she did end up buying a piece of the store, but in the end, she lost everything she built. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I ended the book sort of with her leaving Bendel's because I felt like it was kind of the beginning of the end of that heyday of the department store. Essentially, she became one of the first women to own a piece of of a major department store. I should say that these women were incredible, but the men owned the businesses for almost across the board. And obviously the men had their names on the building. We all know of like Bloomingdale's or Macy's. Those were Bloomingdale Brothers or Roland Macy's, right? So even though the women had all this power, the men were supreme. And so for Geraldine, she became a part owner, but she had these partners who really were in it for a real estate play, and they wanted out of the business, and she couldn't really afford to buy it all herself. So they eventually sold Bendel's to Les Wexner, who owned the Limited, Victoria's Secret. He's now most famously bankrolled Jeffrey Epstein, and he had a very different sensibility than she did. She was incredibly chic and cutting edge and creative, and obviously he was sort of the king of the malls, the mall craze of the 80s, and it was a very different concept, and he came from Ohio, and it was really a clash of cultures. So she left not long after he took over, and before long, Bendel's lost much of its cachet and then stopped selling clothes, and then eventually it closed in 2019.
Yeah, I have to say, as somebody who aspired to shop at Bendel's and then finally had enough money to shop at Bendel's, watching the demise of Bendel's was just one of the saddest shopping experiences I've ever seen.
Barney's was also pretty sad.
Yeah, Barney's was so sad. Thank goodness for Saks. What do you, as you think about this experience of writing the book, of putting it all down, of learning about these women, really getting to know them, what do you take away sort of as the overarching lesson or lessons for the women of today?
Yeah, I mean, I felt so inspired. I felt like I knew about women's lib in the 1960s and 70s and kind of have vague memories in the 80s but I didn't realize kind of the historic continuum that we're part of. And to me, that was so inspiring and emboldening. I wrote a lot of this during the pandemic when I was home with my 2 young children and struggling with my own, trying to balance career and all of that, and seeing what they had dealt with. Like, I was so struck. There was an article, for instance, from 1932 from Good Housekeeping, and it was titled "Marriage or Career," and it was an interview with all these successful women, including Dorothy Shaver, about whether they think they could have a career if they were also married. And I couldn't believe that this was in 1932, and it felt so modern and relevant to today in so many ways. And just that understanding how we're all part of this large, long continuum of women and working women was just amazing to me. And I felt like the women did not meet each other, or as far as I know, they did not have intense interactions, but I felt like they really were in conversation with one another. And I always felt like I was kind of in conversation with them as I was writing it. So all of that is what really stuck with me the most.
The book is When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. You should all read it. You'll love it like Haley, and I loved it, and we will keep our fingers crossed for the movie or the series. Julie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.